The fires that whisper. The ink hadn't dried in Oslo because no ink had been spilled, but the fire had already begun. In Iran, whispers of betrayal laced the wind. Revolutionary Guard hardliners held emergency meetings in bunkered basements. Young Iranians, however, celebrated in poetry cafes and online forums. They shared Razi's quote, "Our faith in diplomacy must be louder than our fear of betrayal." Some framed it as hope. Others called it naivety. Inside a darkened Tehran newsroom, a young female journalist, Samira Karimi, typed furiously, "This is not surrender. This is survival," she whispered. Her piece would go viral across Farsi-speaking regions within hours, but would also put her on a watch list. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, the Knesset erupted. Netanyahu faced brutal questioning from both left and right. He stood firm, quoting Putin, "History rarely forgives the deaf." A right-wing MP slammed the table, and history never forgets the foolish. Yet, in a quiet suburb of Jerusalem, an ex-Mossad analyst told his daughter at dinner, this is the first time in years that diplomacy sounds louder than rockets. The ripple extended. In Riyadh, a conservative cleric issued a fatwa condemning the Oslo talks as a cover for Persian expansion. In Cairo, a university hosted a panel titled, "From Arms to Agreements, Is the Middle East Finally Maturing?" The room overflowed. Online, the hashtag diplomacy or doom trended in 8 languages. But the peace had enemies. A rogue Iranian cell in Syria attempted to sabotage an Israeli outpost near the Golan Heights. The attack failed, but ignited fear. The Israeli Defense Forces retaliated with air strikes on what they described as non-state military positions. The fragile silence cracked. Back in Moscow, Putin met with his advisors. "It's begun," said General Markov. Putin nodded. "Let them whisper. Whispers build pressure, and pressure forces truth." In Washington, the Secretary of State faced criticism from Congress. "You handed legitimacy to regimes who bury dissent," one senator shouted. "But we gave voice to those who want to unbury it," he replied calmly. And in a quiet cafe in Oslo, a Norwegian translator who had worked the summit typed her diary. They came with suspicion. They left with silence. But somewhere in between, there was a flicker of trust. That's all peace ever is. Peace didn't explode into the world. It whispered. And in that whisper, echoing through parliaments, protests, and prayers, was the sound of something rarely heard in the Middle East, a chance. Enemies within. In the weeks that followed Oslo, optimism curdled into unease. At first, diplomatic channels between Tel Aviv and Tehran remained open, though tense. Russia monitored their exchanges through satellite intelligence and human channels, careful not to intervene, but always ready to respond. But beneath the calm exterior, fractures widened. In Tehran, Major General Hossein Falahi of the Revolutionary Guard convened a covert council. "This diplomacy is a virus," he growled, "and Razi has let it in." They planned, not a war, but disruption. Cyber disruption, psychological warfare, subtle sabotage that wouldn't invite retaliation, but would gnaw at trust. Falahi's plan was called Operation Zard, meaning wither. Meanwhile, in Israel, Shin Bet uncovered odd digital activity, malware tracing back to Tehran's Ministry of Information. The breach hadn't reached military servers, but it had touched infrastructure maps. A red flag. Netanyahu called a closed-door session with his cyber intelligence team. "We don't fire missiles," he said. "We fight shadows." But the shadows fought back. The following week, an Iranian news station aired a deep-fake video of an Israeli general supposedly mocking Arab allies. Within hours, protests erupted in Amman, Cairo, and Beirut. The footage was fake. The anger was real. Razi publicly denied involvement, but privately, he was furious. "I promised the world peace," he told his foreign minister, "and my own walls are plotting war." The minister's reply was dry. "Sir, not all fires burn with light." In Moscow, Putin watched it all unfold. His advisor, General Markov, entered his office. "The operation has begun. They're trying to fracture the truce without breaking it." Putin stood, walked to the window, and lit a cigarette. "Diplomacy," he said, "is not a promise. It's a battlefield with quieter weapons." Cyber attacks increased. Stock markets fluttered. Trust began to erode, not by bombs, but by bites. And in the background, a silent resistance took shape. Young coders in Tel Aviv, idealistic hackers in Shiraz, and whistleblowers in both nations who had tasted the idea of peace and refused to let it die. They began communicating anonymously on encrypted forums, calling themselves the Bridge. One message stood out. We are not enemies. We are fire watchers. We won't let history burn again. The real war, it turned out, was no longer between governments. It was between generations. The Bridge Rebellion. Encrypted messages flowed through the underbelly of the internet, like blood through unseen veins. The Bridge, an alliance of anonymous peace warriors from Tel Aviv to Tehran, was no longer just a whisper. It was becoming a heartbeat. Samira Karimi, the journalist turned activist in Iran, now operated from an undisclosed location outside Shiraz. Her pieces, bold-coded revolutionary, were translated into Hebrew and shared on forums in Israel. On the other end, Eitan, a former IDF intelligence analyst, risked arrest to leak anti-escalation briefings. They had never met, but they trusted each other more than their own governments. Their shared platform, called NourNet, became the soul of the Bridge. It featured live feeds, encrypted chat rooms, real-time tracking of government disinformation, and a running tally of digital ceasefire breaches. We track lies the way satellites track storms, one coder posted. Governments noticed. In Tehran, General Falahi issued an internal cyber alert. Find NourNet. Kill it. In Tel Aviv, Shin Bet classified the Bridge as a cross-border psychological risk asset. But the youth were faster. They used onion routing, blockchain-based timestamping, and a flurry of VPNs layered over decoy servers. It was a war of wits and truth fought in silence. Then came the leak. A member of the Bridge, operating under the pseudonym Saul of Nine, uploaded classified documents from Israeli server, proving that hardliners had plotted false flag operations to derail peace talks. The fallout was seismic. International media exploded. Protesters filled the streets of Tel Aviv, chanting, "Not in our name." In Tehran, university students held vigils with candles and placards. Diplomacy deserves defenders. Moscow released a carefully worded statement. It appears the next world war was postponed not by politicians, but by children of war. In Washington, a senator remarked, "This is the first time history is being hacked for good." But not everyone celebrated. Samira's location was compromised. Her last post read, "If I disappear, let my words stay. Tell my mother I tried." Eitan, meanwhile, fled to Cyprus. On his way, he texted a friend, "Maybe peace is just a virus with good intentions." And yet, NourNet remained online, a digital monument to what could be. And across the globe, for the first time in a generation, young people looked at a crisis not as something to fear, but something they could fix. The last deal. The world held its breath. Iran's supreme leader called an emergency assembly of top military, scientific, and political advisors. The betrayal from within, revealed by the Bridge, had shaken his inner circle. "Bring me the scientists," he ordered. One by one, Iran's nuclear physicists were questioned, not about uranium, but about timelines. Could they delay enrichment without appearing weak? Could diplomacy be salvaged without looking like surrender? The room fell into a somber silence. Then, a young female scientist named Dr. Layla Moradi spoke up. "We are at a crossroads," she said softly. "We can build something new with uranium or with understanding, but not both." In Israel, Netanyahu faced his own reckoning. His defense minister presented a disturbing poll. 62% of Israelis now supported the NourNet movement's calls for nonviolent resolution. The streets of Jerusalem were filled with candles, not stones. In a closed cabinet meeting, Netanyahu finally said aloud what he hadn't dared voice. "We may win a war, but we will lose the next generation." Putin, watching both nations falter at the edge of a diplomatic cliff, initiated what would be known as the last deal, a trilateral summit between Moscow, Tehran, and Tel Aviv. It took place in Kazakhstan, away from prying eyes, under heavy snow and heavier security. No journalists, no live feeds, just raw truth. Putin entered the room with a worn leather folder. Inside it, a revised nuclear accord. He placed it on the table. "I offer you one last deal. Freeze enrichment. End cyber aggression. Recognize each other's right to exist, not in slogans, but in systems." Netanyahu crossed his arms. Razi narrowed his eyes. Silence. Then Layla Moradi entered, flanked by a Mossad analyst. "We represent the children who don't want to die for your secrets," she said. Putin nodded. "They have built what we failed to imagine. trust in the void. Hours passed. Tea was served. Threats were exchanged. But at dawn, both leaders signed. Not a treaty, a pause. A commitment to dialogue, renewed every 90 days, reviewed by an independent youth-led digital watchdog, The Bridge. As Raisi inked his name, he muttered, "We haven't made peace, but we've postponed war." Netanyahu, exhausted, added, "Let history record that for once we listened." Echoes of a pause. The sun rose cautiously over Tehran and Tel Aviv, as if unsure whether to shine fully. Satellite news stations blinked from red alerts to white banners. Temporary accord reached. But in the cafes of Beirut, in the alleyways of Gaza, in the snowy parks of Moscow, what the people felt was not celebration. It was hesitation. The world had been given a pause, not peace. And in that stillness, the echoes of the past stirred restlessly. Young Iranians watched news updates with suspicious eyes. "What did we trade away for quiet?" a student asked. In Israel, a father sat with his daughter by the beach. "Abba, does this mean I won't be a soldier?" she asked. He looked at the waves. "I hope so, Noya. I hope this time the grown-ups meant it." At the UN, a new resolution was drafted, one that acknowledged digital movements like the Bridge as legitimate peace-monitoring entities. A first in international law. Putin's press secretary announced, this was not a Russian victory. It was a human delay of destruction. Use it well. But behind closed doors, military hawks on all sides weren't celebrating. In a bunker beneath a hill outside Qom, a hardline cleric met with remnants of the IRGC cyber unit. "Patience is the weapon of the true believer," he whispered. "This pause will pass." And in a Tel Aviv office, a general stared at a wall of maps. NourNet may have distracted the youth, but their optimism won't stop a drone. Meanwhile, the Bridge went global. Youth in Myanmar, Sudan, Venezuela, and Ukraine began uploading manifestos, codes of peace, and truths their governments feared. A new phrase emerged, eco-diplomacy, peace driven not by treaties but by tech and truth. Dr. Layla Moradi, now living in exile, gave a TED-style talk broadcast across encrypted networks. The pause is not the end. It is a hallway. If we decorate it with hope, maybe the next door opens to peace. Benjamin Netanyahu, facing waning popularity, addressed the Knesset. This isn't the peace we dreamt of, but perhaps it's the silence we needed. In Iran, a poster of Layla appeared on a street wall. She spoke so we might live. And on NourNet, the anonymous founder, known as Saul of Nine, posted single line. "We don't want your flags. We want your futures." The silence between storms. Rain fell lightly over Vienna. It wasn't war. It wasn't peace. It was something in between, the kind of quiet that made even birds sing softer. In a dimly lit conference room inside the IAEA headquarters, diplomats sat with steaming mugs and tired eyes. New data showed Iran had honored the enrichment freeze, but the analysts were cautious. History didn't forget so easily. One German envoy whispered to another, "This is the eye. The storm could still be behind us." Back in Jerusalem, NourNet members gathered in an abandoned school. They projected timelines onto cracked blackboards, mapping out possibilities, not enemies. Their new slogan was simple. We're not preparing for war. We're preparing for peace, just in case peace isn't ready. Meanwhile, in Tehran, whispers circled about Layla Moradi's return. The government denied it, but young students printed out her TED Talk and slid copies into library books, chemistry notes, and prayer rugs. At a Moscow cafe, Putin watched a small television in silence. Footage of youth-led rallies from Yemen to Kiev flickered across the screen. He took a sip of tea and muttered, "They speak with less fear than we ruled with." But shadows loomed. A breakaway faction in the IRGC launched a covert AI drone project, one meant to operate without political oversight. In Tel Aviv, a leak revealed a new, preemptive defense initiative funded quietly by American back channels. Saul of Nine posted again on NourNet. They are rehearsing history. We are writing futures. In New York, the UN Secretary General convened a new platform, the Global Pause Forum. Invited youth voices, coders, poets, scientists, even refugees. For once, the table looked like Earth, not just governments. As the forum opened, the keynote speaker wasn't a president, it was a Syrian teen named Amal. She stepped up nervous and said, "My brother died because of a lie spoken by a man in a suit. If we don't break that cycle, more brothers will die." The room fell into silence. Not the dangerous kind, the sacred kind. The world was learning that silence could be resistance, and that maybe, just maybe, the pause could hold. The codes of peace. The first line of the new digital constitution wasn't written by a diplomat, but by a 14-year-old refugee coder in Lebanon. It read, "No peace is valid unless it includes the ones who never had a voice in the first place." The world paused again, but this time not from fear. They were listening. The Global Pause Forum evolved into something unprecedented, a hybrid of think tank, digital parliament, and cultural reset button. Nations still had borders, but the discussions happening within encrypted cloud halls were dissolving the ones in people's minds. Layla Moradi, after weeks in hiding, surfaced in Geneva. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood tech visionaries, dissident poets, and Nobel laureates, all holding hands. Not symbolically, literally, her voice echoed in the hall. What if the next arms treaty was an open source code, not a locked cabinet? What if the right to truth became a human right? Israel's NourNet collective released their framework for frictionless dialogue, a software toolkit that translated sensitive diplomatic language into everyday metaphors for public understanding. An excerpt. When leaders say strategic patience, we'll tell people it means we're afraid to act but too proud to admit it. In Tehran, the government begrudgingly allowed small, peace coding labs to open under academic supervision. The first class sold out in 3 minutes. Russian used live-streamed a coding marathon titled Firewalls for Firepower, dedicated to building defenses against war propaganda. Putin, watching quietly from a snowy dacha, smiled just faintly. In Nigeria, Kenya, Brazil, Indonesia, young minds joined the forum. A planetary alliance of the unheard was rising, not to burn systems, but to overwrite them. And the first trial run of the digital constitution began. It included 10 core lines. All truths must be peer-reviewable. War budgets must be public and annotatable. Every child has a right to know who profits from their silence. AI must serve peace or be silenced. History belongs to the survivors, not the victors. Borders shall not block facts. Leaders must spend 1 week annually living under average citizen conditions. Any act of war must be live-streamed to the world. The internet is a nation for the stateless. Silence, too, shall be counted as a vote. It was radical, imperfect, bold, beautiful. Benjamin Netanyahu was asked in an interview whether he supported it. He paused, then said, "If my grandchildren can live without this madness, yes. Even if it unseats me." And in Tehran, a surprise announcement. President Alavi pledged to ratify the first 3 lines of the digital constitution pending referendum. The West gasped. Iran's youth danced. The code of peace was no longer a dream. It had become a document, a compass, a beginning. When the children led, the press called it a youth quake. But in the streets, it felt more like a dawn. From Gaza to Gaza Street in Nairobi, from Aleppo's cracked walls to London's libraries, children and teens rose, not in protest, but in proposal. They didn't scream slogans. They submitted blueprints. The Global Pause Forum's Youth Wing, now informally called the Future Table, expanded rapidly. They weren't interested in overthrowing governments. They wanted to outgrow them. In Paris, 10-year-old Ismail designed a mobile app called Peace Packs that allowed kids to send virtual ceasefires to each other across languages, across war zones. The app translated fears into promises. I'll be your friend if you stop being afraid. In India, 13-year-old Anya hosted weekly virtual classes teaching Afghan girls how to code in Python. Their shared project, a chatbot that explained global politics in bedtime story format. Layla Moradi visited one of the new labs in Istanbul, where Syrian refugees had installed recycled computers powered by solar panels. On a whiteboard was written, "Rebuild doesn't mean restart. We carry our ruins as foundations." Putin invited 2 student architects from Kazakhstan to the Kremlin. They presented a school design that had no principal's office, only a rotating circle of peer mentors. Why, he asked. They smiled, because fear must not be institutionalized again. In Israel, Netanyahu's own granddaughter, Ruth, went viral on TikTok for this message. "If my grandpa starts another war, he'll have to answer to his grandkids before his parliament. And it wasn't just young people. Parents, teachers, and even former generals began to join them, not out of sympathy but strategy. It became clear the kids weren't naive. They were navigating smarter. One general from South Africa said, "They don't want revenge. They want redundancy for war, for corruption, for everything we told them was just the way things are." The digital constitution evolved with their input. It now had a child-written preamble. We, the unarmed, the unthanked, and the unheard, claim this world not in our name, but in everyone's name who never got a chance. And on the day it was ratified in the forum, the sun rose over every continent at a different time, but for the first time, it felt like one morning, because when the children led, the world finally followed. To be continued in Chapter 26, the peace we built while no one was looking, where the dream of diplomacy outpaces even the powers who once resisted it.